is Eric Olson, and I have a brief bio that I'm going to read. Eric Olson graduated from Wake Forest University and Gonzaga University School of Law. After obtaining his law license, he began a career as a trial lawyer, which took him from the last frontier of Alaska to the Kona coast of the Big Island of Hawaii, to the urban jungle of Memphis, Tennessee, and eventually to Big Sky Country of Montana. Over the course of years, he has represented clients in cases as divergent and challenging as claims of veterans suffering from PTSD as a result of the Vietnam War, industrial accidents suffered by oil field workers on Alaska's North Slope, and labor grievances filed by state troopers, teachers, and others, not to mention a vast array of criminal cases involving charges up to and including first-degree murder. A licensed commercial airplane pilot, an experienced blue water sailor, and a certified scuba diver, Eric has guided Whitewater River expeditions, directed major community theater productions, worked as a referee at all levels of high school football, and taught law and trial practice to law students, lawyers, paralegals, and community resource workers around the country. Eric lives in Missoula, Montana with his wife Mary and his cats Rocky and Cleo. Please welcome Eric Olson.
Wow, all right. Here's your typical local Montana courthouse. You drive by it every day. But did you ever think about how much drama it's seen? Not just in the past year, or 10 years, or even 50 years. Montana has 56 courthouses. The oldest is in Virginia City. It was christened in 1876, just 10 days after General Custer made his fatal mistakes. Hi, I'm Eric Olson. I practiced law in Montana for 25 years, and now I'm writing a series of books telling the tales of Montana's courthouses. There's everything from heartbreak and humility to evil and insanity. I initially thought about writing books of fiction, but as I started to look into the history of each and every courthouse in Montana, I realized the truth was definitely stranger than any fiction. You can buy the books from Amazon or Barnes & Noble, from your local bookstore, or by clicking the link on my website. Montana's courthouses, where the ghosts have the last word on the truth. All right, so that's my crazy little intro to book sales. So there are my books, and that's what in one of my former lives, before I started writing books, I was the training director for the statewide public defender office, and giving presentations like this and trying to match up substance, legal procedure, and IT, audio video, was always a challenge. So I take no responsibility, even though I did it all myself. So anyway, those are my 4 books, and the genesis of this was just an idea that I had some years ago about trying to get the message across about some of the wonderful things that have happened and not so wonderful things that have happened in Montana. And while I was practicing, I had been to a number of courthouses, but I had never been to all of them. And so I thought, I wonder what went on in the courthouses that I didn't get to. And so this is a sort of a little sampling of case findings, stories, tales that I uncovered during a 4-year endeavor, a 4-year search. 56 courts and thousands of... John Kernan. That's my name. Or at least it was when I had need for a name. I don't anymore. You see, I'm dead. When I was 53 years old, a train ran over me in the Forsyth Railroad yard. They buried me in the city cemetery. I was lying peacefully in my grave one night, minding my own business, enjoying the first stage of my eternal journey, when I heard a scratching sound above me. As it grew louder, I began to despair greatly. I opened my mouth to protest, but of course nothing emerged. I was, after all, dead. There followed some bumping and thumping, and then the sound of someone slowly prying the lid off my coffin. Imagine my terror as the light from a kerosene lantern poured into my coffin, and I found myself staring up with unmoving eyes into the face of a man I would come to know as Arthur F. Hughes. I had no idea why he had come to disturb me, but there was bloody little I could do about it as the grave-robbing fiend lifted me from my place of sepulture. Sepulture, there's a word you don't often find occasion to use. It means final resting place. In Montana, it's a crime to remove a dead body from its place of sepulture. Anyway, after Hughes lifted my body out of its place of sepulture, he hauled it out to his homestead and stuffed it into a snowdrift where it lay for several weeks. I was already cold, but I got a whole lot colder. Then, just as I had begun to resign myself to spend an eternity in a deep freeze, things heated up a whole lot. Hughes, you see, pulled me out of the snow, dragged me into his cabin, and then set the cabin on fire. The sheriff found my charred body the next morning, and thinking it was Arthur, notified Arthur's wife, Sarah. Sarah, of course, descended into grief. And when the coroner approached her to get custody of the remains, she went into a crying fit, refusing to surrender them because, as she said, sobbing, "It's all I have left of my dear husband." People get crazy when faced with the loss of a loved one, you know? I mean, can you imagine a more horrible situation? So then what do you suppose this grief-stricken woman did next? If you guessed, got hitched to Tom Elliott, one of Arthur's ranch hands, you win a prize. Yep, within days, the good Mrs. Hughes slid out from beneath the shroud of grief and in between the bed sheets of another man. Oh, did I mention the $8,000 she collected on Arthur's life insurance policy? Now, if the body wasn't Arthur's, where the hell was he during all this? Well, I'll tell you. Long gone, that's where. Off to the Big Apple. It seems that Arthur, a wanderer at heart, had panicked at the thought of spending the rest of his life hunkered down on the Montana prairie with only one woman. To avoid that fate, he had thus concocted a scheme to fake his own death. So there we were. Sarah, all gussied up with a new husband and several $1,000s in mad money. Arthur, having assumed a new identity as a longshoreman in New York City. Tom Elliott, happily married to the wife of his former employer. And me, torn from my eternal slumber and burned beyond recognition, merely a pawn on the chessboard of the lives of three people I had never met. It was at that point that a coroner's jury in Wellington County threw a monkey wrench into Arthur's carefully designed plan. As Arthur had hoped, the jury did conclude that the burned body found in the cabin was his. However, they went one step further. They concluded that both the cabin fire and Arthur's resultant death were the consequence of foul play. The Honorable Judge Charles Crum issued an arrest warrant for both Sarah and Tom, who had just gotten married. They spent their honeymoon night in the Wellington County jail. That might have been the end of the story. Sarah and Tom might have gotten convicted of the first-degree murder of Arthur Hughes and sentenced to hang, and Arthur might have spent the rest of his life traveling to exotic ports of call, and my name might have passed into the fog of history, except for one thing. In September of 1913, after Rosebud County Sheriff William Moses
caught a rumor that Arthur was still alive, he hired detectives to find him. He also dug up my grave and discovered that all it contained was a railroad tie. Well, the detectives brought Arthur W. Hughes back to Forsyth on the train. Might have been the same train that killed me, for all I know. They charged him with removing a corpse from its place of sepulture. Judge Crum sentenced him to 2 years of hard labor in the state prison. And Sarah? They dropped the murder charges, of course. Couldn't very well convict her of killing someone who wasn't dead. But they got their pound of flesh. She went to prison for 2 years for bigamy. And me? Well, the sheriff saw to it that my body got put back in its proper place of sepulture.
Those are stories like that all over the state. That's one of my favorites, but there's just so many of them. As I said, 56 courthouses. There's the counties of Montana, you know most of them. Thousands of stories. I went through many of them. A lot of the smaller counties, I was able to take the docket book and go back to the very beginning and look at every single case that ever went through the district court. Some of the larger counties, of course, I had to rely on contemporary accounts and newspapers and so forth. But I managed to dig out a lot of really interesting, important stories that take their place in the 4 books that I've written. There they are again. They all have a similar theme, courting. We've already seen the video, so we'll skip past that. So how are these books put together, and how did I decide to tell the stories so that people would hopefully want to read them and learn from them? Because one of the challenges that I had in my mind when I decided to leave the practice of law, having seen enough of the justice system, was to link together the concepts of truth and justice and law, along with the concept of facts, something that seems to have gotten lost here in our recent history. What is a fact? We always were taught in law school and elsewhere, and most people believe that a trial is a search for the truth. But in order to search for something, you have to know what it is. And truth is a very elusive concept. I decided that the best way to try to give the messages and preserve the histories that I was discovering and wanting to talk about was in the form of stories. Because while you may remember a fact, and while you may remember a scientific principle, and while you may remember a date and an event, it won't have any meaning to you unless you can relate it to a story. And one of the things that trial lawyers learn, if they are good at what they do, is how to relate to juries. And one of the best ways to relate to juries is not only to relate it to the individual juror, but to put it in the form of a story so that if they don't remember anything else, they at least remember the story that you told them. That can help you and it can hurt you. If the story doesn't pan out in the course of the evidence that's presented, makes it a little more challenging. But if it does, then they have your version of the truth, and that's what they can use as they go back in the jury room. So what is my narrative style in these books? How do I tell the histories? These stories are all true. Every single story that's related in my 4 books of 56 different chapters, and there's 7, 8, 10, 12 stories in each chapter, every single one of those stories is true. How they're related, however, sometimes comes in through more fanciful narrative concepts. This is Steer, the big guy in the upper right-hand corner behind the glass box there talking to me. That's Steer. Steer is the largest, at least history tells us, it's the largest steer that was ever roaming in America. Almost 2 tons worth. He was born and raised out in eastern Montana, and he was eventually, when he died, taxidermed. Is that a verb? He was separated and reconstructed, and he traveled around on a trailer throughout the Northwest. His owner displayed him. He had two brothers named Bulgy and Spot. They weren't as big as he was. For the last umpteen years, he has been on display in the Fallon County Museum, which is in the old Fallon County Jail, the building, which is right next door to the new Fallon County Courthouse in Baker. That's the courthouse in the upper left, that's the courtroom in the lower left, and that's Steer. So the stories in Fallon County were told to me by Steer as I sat there and interviewed him, because I figured who knew more about the history of Fallon County Court than Steer, who's been sitting there all these years listening to it. That's the legendary white wolf of Judith Basin. Why would I talk to a wolf about stories from courthouses in Stanford, Judith Basin? Well, the answer is this wolf, this actual wolf right here, terrorized the Judith Basin area for 20 years, from 1910 to 1930. In the course of his predatory life, he was responsible for the destruction of somewhere around $40,000 worth of livestock, which back in the teens and 20s is quite a bit of money. And those of us in Montana can appreciate that ranchers and farmers weren't very happy about the romantic figure of the great white wolf. There were imitation great white wolves that got hunted and stalked and killed during that period of time, but the great white wolf finally met his demise in 1930 at the hands of a rancher named Al Close, who shot him right above the eye. Took the carcass, dragged it into town, had a big celebration, stuffed him, and then, guess what? Set him in his stuffed form in the lobby of the Judith Basin Courthouse. And there he stood for more than 60 years, watching the goings and comings. Who would be better to tell me the stories from Judith Basin County than the great white wolf? There he is now. They've moved him. He's not in the courthouse anymore. He's in a little mini mall that's in, indoor mall that's in downtown Stanford. Kind of sad, really. He's not able to be seen by as many people as before. The old expression from the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance movie, when legend becomes fact, print the legend. That's Tom and Curly, and they talked to me out on the Little Bighorn battlefield in Bighorn County and told me the stories from the courthouse in Bighorn County. When I visited Broadwater County, I went to a chess match between two famous and long deceased trial lawyers, Wellington Rankin, who many of you know the name of, Jeanette Rankin's brother, who was a preeminent trial lawyer, former attorney general, candidate for governor, associate justice briefly of the Supreme Court in Montana, and a guy named Frank Hooks, who was a local trial lawyer right there in Townsend for many years. And at the Grand Hotel in Big Timber, I watched a card game in the Grand Hotel between long since passed members of the community, including Sim Roberts. And interestingly enough, the other day I received an email from Sim Roberts' great-grandson, who had come across reference to him in one of my books and was very excited about learning more about the life of his great-grandfather. That's the Sweetgrass County Courthouse on the left and the courtroom on the right. The hanging judge from Musselshell County, maybe some of you remember Judge Nat Allen. Nat Allen was a very prominent figure in Montana legal history. Graduated from law school at the University of Montana in the early 1930s, and before he was even out of law school, he put his name in for a candidate for county attorney in Golden Valley County, Rygate. And Rygate is part of a judicial district that includes Musselshell County and two other counties, Wheatland and Marr County. And one of the first cases he got involved in was the famous case of Lee Simpson, who killed several people in a big, started out with an argument about farm credit, and wound up with him killing several people, and he wound up getting hanged. His appeal went to the governor for clemency, and Alan was the young prosecutor who invited Wellington Rankin into the case to prosecute for the death penalty, and they hanged him. So he got the reputation, before he even became a judge, of being the hanging judge. And so I had an opportunity. He passed away some years ago. And while I had met Judge Allen during his life, I had never practiced in front of him, and certainly by the time I was chatting with him about cases, he was off the scene. That's the Montana Bar in Miles City, downtown Miles City. Famous bar, goes back into the early part of the 20th century. And one night after midnight, I got invited to come down to the Miles City Bar, the Montana Bar. And I sat right in that booth right there and talked to many figures from the middle part of the 19th century on. And that's where the stories came from that are in the Custer County. So enough of that silliness. That's just that's my narrative style. So here's a question. How many people have ever heard of Newlawn, Montana? You know where Newlawn is? Okay. Right. So Newlawn, up in northeastern Montana. Look for it on a map. There it is. That's Newlawn, Montana today. The proverbial wide spot in the highway. Sits between Sidney and Glendive, up on the highway that runs along not far from the North Dakota state line. Why am I bringing your attention to Newlawn? Well, there's a story that I came up against in the courts out there, and it's a Montana outhouse tale, from courthouse to outhouse. And there's the case citation down at the bottom. Dan Keaton was a obstreperous, contentious sort who back in the early part of the 20th century was working and living and bothering people along the line of country that I just talked about. At the time, there was a small but fairly vibrant community in Newlawn, which had a roadhouse at its center. And the roadhouse, of course, was dispensing drinks to people and being a social center for ranchers, farmers, and transients who came through. Keaton got out of control. The facts aren't important. And the owner of the roadhouse, who was basically the guy who was the center of Newlawn, John Ollinger, tossed him out. Don't come back. You're causing too much trouble. I don't want you in here. Keaton didn't take well to that. He went away and decided he was going to get even with Mr. Ollinger. So he came back and he planted a bomb in Mr. Ollinger's outhouse, out behind the roadhouse, and waited until Mr. Ollinger left the bar and ignited the bomb. The bomb went up, blew up the outhouse. Fortunately, Mr. Ollinger wasn't hurt. The sheriff came and arrested Keaton, took him down to Glendive, which at that time was the county seat for the greater Dawson County, and put him on trial. He got convicted, not of attempted murder, but of who knows what, assault, and went into Glendive jail, the Dawson County jail, for several months. When he got out, you would have thought he would have learned his lesson, but he didn't. And he came back, loaded for bear, as we say, made a beeline back to Ollinger's saloon, walked in one night, started trouble, wound up in a gunfight, and wound up on the short end of the fight. Mr. Ollinger got a gun and shot him. Sheriff arrested Mr. Ollinger. They took him down to Glendive, put him on trial for murder. The entire population of the Newlawn area came to the courthouse, packed the courthouse in support of Mr. Ollinger. There's a defense that we sometimes use as a criminal defense lawyer. There are only a limited number of defenses available in a homicide case. And one of the defenses, which is never verbalized but clearly understood sometimes, is that the son of a bitch just needed to be killed. And that's what happened to Mr. Keaton. Mr. Ollinger got acquitted. Anybody know the name of Ellen Knowles? Now we're starting to zero in on history. Okay, Ellen Knowles, otherwise known as Ellen Knowles Haskell. She was the first woman lawyer in Montana. She passed the bar, and initially, they wouldn't admit her because they couldn't figure out the way the law was worded, whether it meant that women were included in the intent of the licensing law. Well, she sued on her own name and got the law changed and got admitted to practice the day after Christmas in 1889. She was 29 years old. another interesting part of her story, she went on, eventually in life, she moved back to Butte and became a very successful lawyer in Butte and an advocate for women and others. But during the period of time that she was getting herself admitted to the practice of law, 1889, when Montana became a state, she decided to run for attorney general. She put her name in. She wasn't content to merely be a licensed lawyer. She put her name in for the election to become the attorney general. And although she ran third, she was defeated by a man named Henry Haskell, who became the first attorney general of Montana. But she was so impressive to the voters and to Mr. Haskell that he asked her to marry him. And she did. She moved up and formed an office with him up in Glendive. And they practiced there for several years. Eventually, she divorced him and moved back to Butte. But that's the history of the first woman attorney in Montana. Okay, so the Deer Lodge County Courthouse. This is a Montana geography question. Right. The answer to that is it's false. It's confusing, but it's false because there is a courthouse in Deer Lodge. But the Deer Lodge County Courthouse is in Anaconda. And a quick story from Anaconda. There's the courthouse, beautiful old courthouse, and a beautiful interior which has recently been reworked. The case of State versus C.C. Thornton, and I'll see if I can tell this in short form because it's a great story. 1890, March. C.C. Thurston is a very well-to-do resident of Anaconda, quite rich. Goes to Denver, falls in love with a woman named Fanny Van Buren, who's younger than he. She recognizes the allure of moving to Montana and living with this rich guy, and he recognizes the allure of having her as his partner. So he takes her, sweeps her up, they get married, and then they go on a 2-week honeymoon, which takes them all over the Northwest, out to San Francisco, living in the highest of styles. 2 weeks later, they come back to Anaconda and settle in for wedded bliss. The problem is, 2 or 3 days after she's back in Anaconda, she's sashaying down the sidewalk to the office of the best lawyer in Anaconda. She walks in and she says, I have to tell you that my honeymoon, and therefore my marriage, was a colossal disappointment. Now, we can read into that anything that we want. I wouldn't know. I don't remember what goes on in honeymoons. Been too many years. But she was pretty specific. And she said, I need to divorce this guy. I'm colossally disappointed. Well, Mr. Thurston was dumbstruck. He couldn't understand why this beautiful bride that he had had such a good time with was accusing him of that. But if there's one thing he didn't want, it was to have it get around town that he had colossally disappointed his wife. The lawyer that Fanny Van Buren went to decided, I'm not sure that colossal disappointment, in whatever form that takes, is adequate legal grounds for divorce. Therefore, he hired a private investigator to do some background work on C.C. Thurston. And they uncovered a story in Boston from several years earlier, which indicated that Mr. Thurston had been previously married in Boston to a woman named Carolyn Humphreys. But what's more, they could find no record of Mr. Thurston and Ms. Humphreys ever being divorced. Therefore, eureka, Mr. Thurston is a bigamist. They bring this matter to Mr. Thurston's attention, and he says, I don't know what you're talking about, but I can't let my name get smeared, so what do you want? And he gives her a divorce and a very, very generous settlement as part of the divorce. Miss Van Buren and her lawyer take the money, and they run back to his office. I'm being a little figurative here. And they count the money out on the table, and she looks at it, and she decides, you know what? I'm due more than that. That's not enough that he divorced me and gave me a healthy hunk of his fortune. My name has been slandered because, my God, my virtue has been compromised by marrying a man who's already married to somebody else. So she files a civil suit in Deer Lodge District Court demanding damages, additional damages for damage to her name, her good name, and her reputation. And then, there's one more, her lawyer goes down the street to the county attorney's office and says, you know, this man's a bigamist, and you should try him as a bigamist, and bigamy is a crime. So the county attorney files a civil complaint for bigamy, and the civil attorney files a civil case for additional damages to the reputation of his client. Well, all of Anaconda is up in arms because Mr. Thurston is a well-liked person in the community, and they don't know who this Fanny Van Buren is. The case gets set for trial. Always remember that there's two sides to an argument, and when you have a lawyer, remember that I have a lawyer too, or that's otherwise been described as, be careful what you wish for. Mr. Thurston, who was a man of considerable means, hired lawyers, and what do you suppose they dug up? Fanny Van Buren herself was still married to a lawyer in Denver. Case goes to trial, all the evidence comes in, and by then, the jury, made up of Mr. Thurston's friends and community members, was about everything they could do to sit through the trial, the civil trial, going on at the same time as the criminal trial. The case ends, and the jury, it ends in the late afternoon, and the jury says, before we deliberate, we'd like to get dinner. So the bailiff takes them across the street to the finest restaurant in town, and they sit down and they have a nice meal, courtesy of the taxpayers of Deer Lodge County. When they finish the meal, they go back into the courthouse, close the door to the jury room within 15 minutes. They've reached their verdict, throwing Fanny Van Buren out of court and dismissing the charge for bigamy against Mr. Thurston. So that's Anaconda Deer Lodge, not Deer Lodge Powell. And moving right along here, there we go. So the Powell County Courthouse is in Deer Lodge. So got to keep that straight. We have a Choteau, Montana, and a Choteau County, Montana. They're not the same. Choteau, the town of Choteau is the courthouse of Teton County, and Choteau, Montana, the courthouse is located in, drawing a blank, I'll get it. Where? I'll get it. Anyway, I'm on Deer Lodge right now. And there's a town of Fallon, which has a great story associated with it, that's not part of Fallon County. Anyway, the Powell County Courthouse has a story associated with it that crosses over historically into another county later on in this man's life.
George Rock owned a saloon in Jordan. He was also regarded by some as an obstreperous malcontent who seemed to spend his life chasing one argument after another. For a variety of reasons, Rock was well known to most of the law enforcement officers in the northeastern counties of Montana at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1904, Rock got into a fight with a man named Ed Curl. The two men hurled some fighting words at each other, but no blood was drawn. After a few tense moments, Curl shrugged his shoulders and left the saloon. Rock wasn't so easily mollified, however. As Curl walked down the main street of Jordan, Rock chased after him and shot him with an automatic pistol. Curl pitched forward and died instantly. The sheriff arrested Rock straight away and put him on trial for murder. In the spirit of the Old West, Rock's lawyers tried to argue that the shooting was nothing more than self-defense arising from a mutual gunfight, an unavoidable consequence of life in small turn-of-the-century western town. The jury wasn't buying it. For one thing, every single witness, and there were several, testified that Curl, unarmed at the time, was walking away from Rock when the shots were fired. For another, George Rock was pretty widely despised, not only in Jordan, but in the whole area. So much so that the judge as much as told the jury to just ignore the presumption of innocence and go ahead and convict him, which is just what they did, of second-degree murder. And after they did, the judge sent George Rock on down the road to the state prison in Deer Lodge on a 99-year sentence. And it's in Deer Lodge where George Rock moved into an even more ignominious place in Montana history when, during an attempt to escape from the prison, he slashed the throat of Deputy Warden John A. Robinson. But that's a story for another day. The first time George Rock murdered a man is one of several tales included in the Garfield County chapter of Courting Justice.
So George Rock gets himself in trouble, as you heard, in Garfield, and gets himself shipped down to the state prison. And in a matter of several years, he was one of the most difficult prisoners they ever had down there. In a matter of several years, he led an attempted prison break, which is very famous in Montana history, in which he confronted Warden Frank Conley, who has got enough in his life to write several books about. And John Robinson, who also was a very renowned lawman and was working as deputy warden at the time. Tragically, the event, precipitated by 4 inmates, wound up in the death of Robinson, and George Rock eventually got hanged for the killing of Deputy Robinson. There's no reason that you should recognize that name. If you do, I'd worry about you, because you wouldn't have a life. I dug that out of the records of the Fallon County courthouse in Baker. And Mrs. M.A. Murphy did nothing intentional to become famous. But the fact is, she did become famous. She's the first woman, as far as we know, to ever sit on a jury, a district court jury, in a felony criminal case in Montana. And there's a little clip from a little history book that says there was quite a very interesting battle that went on back and forth through the early part of the 20th century between women and others, trying to get women to sit on juries. And it wasn't as easy as giving them the vote, which of course happened earlier. Even after women got the vote, there was contentious debate about whether women really wanted to be on juries. They should be home caring for their families and didn't need to get dragged into all this garbage that goes on, particularly in criminal cases. But in 1939, the legislature finally became convinced and passed a law that took effect at the end of the year. And Mrs. Murphy wound up sitting as a juror in the case of State versus Fred Pennow, was a murder case. So little piece of arcane trivia you can use to get somebody with sometime. Ozymandias. Might remember this from junior high school when you came across it. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." That poem's by Percy Shelley, and it's from obviously many years ago, and maybe you came across it as I did in high school, and it's a poem about history and the desolation and the rise of mighty empires and the fall, and all that remains are the sculpted stones, wreckage lying in the desert. And why is that relevant to anything that I'm talking about today? Well, it's relevant because there's a little town up in northeastern Montana in Valley County called St. Marie. And St. Marie is the former Glasgow Air Force Base. And the former Glasgow Air Force Base, and I swear to you, this is what happened when I drove up there. I've known for years, I know people whose parents served there, who were born there, who lived there. And I remember Glasgow during the years of Red Alert back in the 50s when we were all crouching under tables because the atomic bomb was going to get us all and we had to learn how to protect ourselves. And Glasgow was founded as a bomber Air Force base to house long-range bombers, bomber training, because it's out on the prairies of Montana. And it rose. At one point, there were as many as 20,000 people who were living there and operating as a very viable Air Force base. And then gradually, it fell off. And by the early 70s, it was a ghost town. And the Air Force almost literally locked the key, turned the lock, and walked away, and left this giant Air Force base up there on the prairies of Montana without function. And that's what came to mind as I drove up there, was this poem Ozymandias about how the mighty have fallen into decay. And those are just a couple pictures that I took about the abandoned Air Force base. And it's spooky. And I grew up in the military, and I identified with the architecture and the pastel-colored homes that were built in barracks style and otherwise across the area. Well, there's a case that comes out of Valley County in 1981. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but it's a very interesting story of a guy named James Holmes. And here's one little aspect of it. When the Glasgow Air Force Base collapsed, some people in the area, some entrepreneurs in the area, decided to organize this group called the Valley Industrial Park. And the idea was to take the land that the Air Force Base sat on and develop it into an industrial park, light industry, as a means of attracting employment and growing the tax base, obviously, of the county. And this guy Holmes was hired to be the executive director of the VIP, the Valley Industrial Park. In 1980, and there's a bunch of shenanigans that went on that I don't have time to get into right now, but in 1980 or 81, I can't remember exactly, Mount St. Helens blew its top. And ash went all over the Northwest. Some of it, I'm sure, drifted into Montana. I was living in Alaska at the time. But when that happened, Boeing, which is in Seattle, which is very near the volcano, had a major problem on their hands because the air was filled with ash particles, which when sucked into the engines of jets, destroys them. And so they couldn't conduct the training, the ongoing training that they were doing with their fleet, with their pilots, with their navigators and the others who needed ongoing practice. So this guy Holmes came up with an idea that the Valley Industrial Park had negotiated with the federal government at the time the Air Force walked away and had obtained the rights to the Air Force base and everything that was on it. The theory was that the Air Force had taken everything of value, and the land and the buildings were there, and the industrial park could use it. But Holmes discovered he's not the Valley Industrial Park. He's the president or the executive director. So he is a single person operating outside the umbrella of the corporation. He discovered that the Air Force Base was honeycombed with fuel lines, how they used to transmit jet fuel from the tanks out to the runway where they would fuel the aircraft. And when the Air Force left, they did what's called pickling, which means they cleaned out the lines and they inserted a sodium and other chemical formula, which was designed to keep the pipes from rusting, to keep the lines good, but there's no fuel in them. And the idea is that at some point down the road, they can reuse the lines if they ever want to, but it also removes the fuel. Well, Mr. Holmes discovered that there were actually several fuel lines that had not been cleaned out and several tanks that had not been pickled. And it turned out to be almost 250,000 gallons of jet fuel. And so when VIP made the contract with Boeing to let the Boeing aircraft come over to Glasgow and use the airstrip there, the airfield, Holmes decided on his own to form a company called Aerofuel. And on behalf of Aerofuel, he contracted with the federal government to sell them, with the Boeing, to sell them the jet fuel that they would need from this reserve that he had of 250,000 gallons. And that's several $100,000 of asset value. Well, the fact that there are several court cases ought to tell you how the community of Valley County and the people involved and Boeing felt about Mr. Holmes attempting to make his own fortune off the fuel that was not his, that belonged to the VIP and should have gone into the coffers of VIP instead of into his own pockets. So there's a fascinating series of cases that went through the district court in Valley County, charging Mr. Holmes with felony theft, conversion of property, and so forth. And I thought that was a really interesting side story to all the things that have gone on in Valley County. Anybody recognize that name? If you're from Butte, maybe you've come across that name. Gertrude Pitkanen.
I'm Mrs. Gertrude Pitkanen. Some folks refer to me as Butte's notorious abortion doctor, but I surely hope that history has remembered me for more than just that. I was originally trained as a surgical nurse in Chicago. In 1907, when I was 20 years old, I moved to Butte, where I met my husband, who was a chiropractor. I decided to assist him in his practice, so I too became a chiropractor. We worked together for a number of years, and when he died in 1930, I took over his practice, which included not only administering chiropractic treatments, but fostering adoptions for unwanted children. Oh yes, when necessary, I also performed abortions. The first time I ever had any direct contact with the criminal courts was in September of 1929, when I was accused of falsifying a death certificate. A young Anaconda schoolteacher named Violet had died of a heart attack. For some reason, officials in the sheriff's department decided that the coroner should perform an autopsy. During the inquest, there was some testimony which suggested that perhaps Violet had died while undergoing an abortion procedure. I can assure you, however, that her death was the consequence of a myocardial infarction and not some botched surgical procedure, which is exactly what I attested to when I signed the death certificate. I want to emphasize something. This young woman was pregnant, and she had come to see me in order to become fully informed regarding each of the options she was considering. But I knew nothing, absolutely nothing about any sort of operation, illegal or otherwise. Violet's own fiancé corroborated that at the inquest. The simple fact was that Violet wasn't well, as I learned to my great dismay. Her heart simply gave out on her at a most unpropitious time. Now, it's true that before they left the courthouse, the jury sent a note to the judge. "We, the jury," it read, "censure Gertrude Pitkanen for signing a false death certificate and for having the body moved to an undertaking parlor without notifying the coroner." Well, there was nothing to that. It was all just a political thing. As a result, the case was dismissed for lack of evidence. Still, though, for the next few years, the authorities in Butte dragged me into court a number of times. If you want to learn about it all, read Chapter 2 of Eric Olson's book, Courting Justice. It's available from Amazon and other booksellers.
So now, do you have a secret that's so dark in your past that you would only reveal it on your deathbed? You don't have to reveal it. But it's an interesting question. And it leads into, again, another one of my favorite stories. That's the Liberty County Courthouse in Chester. Chester's up outside Havre, joins Hill County. And I happen to know from my years in the practice the clerk up there, whose mother was the clerk before she was. And her mother goes, her time in office goes back into the late 70s. And when I emailed her to say, hey, I'm going to come up, and she had known me from I had spoken to the clerks a couple of years earlier about my first book, and she had known me from that and other occasions. So I sent her an email and I said, hey, Ann, I'm coming up on this day, and I'd like to give you a heads up so I can take a look at your files. And she said, oh, I'm so excited. She says, I'll make sure my mother's here because she has a story that you need to hear. So I drove up this a couple years ago, and I sat in the courthouse. That's the courtroom. That's an exploded view of the courtroom in the upper left-hand corner of the courthouse. And I sat and read through the files, and then Ann had her mother come over and went into the clerk's office and sat, and she told me this story. It was like a lot of small counties in Montana. Let's just say there are times when there's not a whole lot going on in the courthouse, and the clerks are always busy and very careful at their jobs. But oftentimes you can go in there and there won't be a huge press of business going on. And such was the case in a late summer afternoon in the early 1980s. When the phone rang in the late afternoon and the clerk answered it, and she said, "This is Liberty County District Clerk." And on the other end of the phone was what she perceived to be a young man, not a teenager, but a young man's voice, who said, "I don't know if there's anything you can do for me. I'm calling you from California." And the clerk said, "Well, anything, go ahead and ask. I mean, if I can help you, I will." And he said, "This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. My grandmother is dying, and she's telling my sister and my wife and me that she once killed a man in Montana." And the clerk said, "Well, okay. When was this?" He said, "We don't know." And he said, "What's her name?" And he said, "Edith Martin." And she said, "Well, I can check and see if there's an Edith Martin around." But he said, "I don't even know why I'm calling you." He said, "All she will say is, I have to tell you, I killed a man in Montana." And when we asked her any questions, she just had one word. She kept saying, "Chester. Chester." And we asked my uncle and everybody, who's this guy Chester? And nobody knows. And I mean, we didn't even know she'd ever been to Montana. And the clerk said, "Well, let me see. This, in fact, I'm the Liberty County clerk, and I'm in the town of Chester, and maybe that's what she's talking about. I don't know. Let me look it up and call you back." So she went into the archives and started to look back, and eventually was able to cross-reference. It's one of those counties I told you about that here's the book, and here's all the cases that ever went into the court. So I can tell you pretty quickly all the homicide cases that we had, where the defendant was a female, and then we can see if there's any correlation there. And of course, part of the conversation happened. Yeah, and she says she went to trial and got found guilty, or she went to trial or something. We can't make it up. Long story short, they found the story from 1920, which is the very, very beginning of Liberty County, of a woman named Edith Philippin who was living with her husband on a ranch. And the short version of the story is that she was home one night, her husband was in town, and the ranch hand came into the house, who was living in the house, came upstairs into the hall, the floor where Edith and her husband were living, and raped her in her bedroom. And how complete the sexual assault was, nobody really knows. Obviously, there's only so much information that people give, but the reconstructing the case, not from Grandma, because she didn't give any more information, but from the court records, it appeared that she had at least eventually acknowledged that there had been some form of sexual assault that had occurred. The husband came back and she told him. He got upset and he said to the ranch hand, whose name I don't remember right now, "You're invited to get out of here and don't come back." The guy left, came back a couple days later. He said, "I left some stuff here. I need to get my stuff." The husband was out in the barn with one of the other ranch hands. He said, "I need to get some stuff. I left a box here, or a suitcase or something." The husband kind of shrugged it off. The man walked toward the house. Edith appeared in the doorway, saw him coming, took a gun and shot him, killed him. They took him to the hospital down the road, eventually I think to Great Falls, and he died. And so the sheriff investigated and put her on trial. She went to trial. I always think about it as one of the first earliest known cases of spousal abuse or domestic abuse, even though he wasn't a spouse. And she was acquitted. And shortly after that, she left Montana and moved to California, where she lived the rest of her life without saying a word to anybody. And that's how the story was uncovered in the archives of the Liberty County Court. And it's Liberty County District Court case number 2, so you can see that it. And I write about case number 1, but I don't remember what it was. I think it was a theft case. But all right, so that brings me to kind of the conclusion here, which is sedition. And my books have a number of cases, references to a number of cases of sedition that occurred around Montana. But the question is that people sometimes react to is, a lot of times what you knew about sedition was what you learned in high school, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And I mean, why worry about that? That was 200 and some years ago. What does sedition have to do with anything that anybody today needs to worry about? After all, I think we can all agree that the past is over, right? I mean, why worry about the past? It's over. And furthermore, fool me once, shame on you. I won't get fooled again. That's a lame attempt at humor. President George W. Bush, who got all tongue-tied over the old expression of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. The point is, why do we need to remember something like sedition, the Alien and Sedition Acts? To refresh our memory, and we need to read these carefully, Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by a one-party dominated Congress. That happened to be the Federalist Party. They were signed into law by President John Adams in 1798. Here's our players down here across the bottom. Right to left, that's Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. It made it harder for immigrants to become citizens. Now, the United States of America at that point is, what, 11 years old? I can't imagine that well over 50% of the people who were American citizens were immigrants, people who had been immigrants before there was an America, who had been living here and who had become Americans when America was born. It allowed the president to imprison and deport non-citizens who were deemed dangerous or who were from a hostile nation. And it criminalized, and this is the big point that I try to talk about in the book, criminalized making false statements that were critical of the federal government. In other words, running your mouth off about something that you don't agree with, that the current Congress, President, Supreme Court, pick your point of authority, is doing. There's a statement that most of us who are historians cherish. And you see it in a lot of different, it's quoted and misquoted and unquoted and reconstructively quoted, various versions of it. The closest I can find to the actual quote is those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, the Spanish philosopher and historian George Santayana. But it's attributed, I was joking with somebody before the presentation today that there's 6 or 8 people that you always attribute quotes to if you don't know who did them. Mark Twain, Oscar Wilde, so this is one that Churchill gets quoted with this sometimes. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So why is sedition important to us today? Well, in the book, in all 4 books, I tell stories of Montanans, people from right here in Montana, who ran across the sedition law, and it changed their lives. I can tell you from personal experience that it is no fun when the government, local government, state government, federal government, law enforcement, decides to zero in on you. It's a lonely, lonely, terrifying experience, which is why I guess God invented lawyers to be defense lawyers, because you need someone that can help shepherd you through the system, whether you did it or whether you didn't do it, whether the law is clear, whether the law is unclear. It's a dehumanizing experience. On the left is a little clip from a newspaper about Florence Miller of Columbia Falls, who was the first woman ever convicted of sedition in Montana. And what she got convicted on was the following statement, quote, "I hope the Germans get every American who goes over there. Germany will win the war." Now that's 1917, and America has just gotten into the Great War. The conference that's starting here for the next 2 days, one of the big themes of it is the centennial of World War I and all the hysteria that arose out of patriotism and sedition and the conflict. making the world safe for democracy, getting on the boat, going over to Europe to fight the Huns, the Germans, the enemies of democracy. And all the people who stayed behind, who maybe weren't so excited about what was going on over there, many of whom had family and friends on the other side because it had only been a short period of time since they had come to America to make a better life for themselves and their families. On the right is a very moving story of Janet Smith and her husband, W.K. Smith. They were the postmasters in Sale, Montana. Anybody ever heard of Sale? It's in Powder River County. It doesn't much exist anymore. At one point, it was a small little community and had a post office. It's about halfway up the road between Broadus, which is in Powder River County, and Miles City, which is in Custer County. Janet Smith and WK were German immigrants, but they believed in America, and they were running the post office, which is about as American an institution as you can find, at least it used to be. There's an old saying which contextually translates itself into the culture that's using it, which is that heaven is high and the king is far away. It's a Chinese expression, heaven is high and the emperor is far away. What it means is that God's up there and the president or the king or the emperor, I've never seen him before. He's somewhere over the horizon and doesn't have any influence in my life. And that's an expression which stands for the fact that, hey, I'm out here, I'm doing my thing, and I'm not going to get bothered by what those people try and tell me to do. Montana has a particular affinity for that, historically, believing that we know things about life that other people don't know. It's a hardscrabble country. So Janet and WK were running their post office, and they were having a conversation. And Mrs. Smith just casually was telling her neighbors that she opposed the war and that she was not going to buy war bonds. That was a big thing back in 1917. That's how you fund the war effort. You buy bonds. That gives the government enough money to buy the armaments and the uniforms and the gasoline that they need to join the war effort. If you don't believe in the war, you don't want to buy a war bond, but you didn't have much choice back in 1917 America, because if you didn't buy war bonds, you were regarded as being unpatriotic because everybody supported the Great War. She said that instead of forcing people to buy war bonds, the government ought to simply kill the cripples, the mentally ill, and the criminals. Right? Hey, I don't have any use for anybody that can't pull their weight. Government ought to just get rid of them. Everyone in this country would be better off if the Germans won the war. Her husband, who was less vocal, agreed with her, repeated her sympathies. Well, heaven is high and the president is far away, but lo and behold, she got arrested because several of her conversational companions decided they didn't much care for that attitude, and they reported her, and the sheriff came and arrested the two of them, put them on trial. They both got convicted of sedition and sentenced to prison. WK, I think, got 10 to 20 years in state prison, and Janet got, I think, 5 years. There's a great book, which I noticed is on sale here, called Darkest Before Dawn. It's about the sedition madness in Montana, and there are central figures. The sedition stories are very powerful elements of Montana's history, and they are in all 4 of my books. And I just think that it's important for all of us to remember how our lives can be touched by laws that we maybe don't even understand or have any particular support for. So, is sedition relevant today? That quote was taken word for word off Senator Steve Daines' Twitter account, as was the flag. This year, quote, "This year I introduced a constitutional amendment to ban the burning of the American flag. It is the symbol of American freedom and heroism," unquote. That's a thought-provoking comment. The Supreme Court has on several occasions declared that burning the flag because you disagree, hey, I'm a child of the Vietnam era. Burning the flag because you disagree with what the government is doing, that's a statement. And as a statement, it's protected by the First Amendment. You might not like it. You might not like it when the Nazis march in Skokie, but we have a First Amendment that protects speech. On the other hand, we all know that you can't scream fire in a crowded theater because that provokes a panic that can endanger people. And so we're walking this very, very narrow line between honoring the First Amendment and the speech and expression that's protected by it, and recognizing that to many, many people, the American flag is a symbol of freedom and heroism. So I take no position today. I'm simply pointing out that studying history, for the reasons that I've indicated, is critical if we're going to move forward in a positive way. I got a Facebook page. Every week I post a story like some of the ones you saw today. I'm going to cover all 56 counties. I have a couple of cases each week that I post, a little trivia question and so forth. The Facebook page is the Montana Courthouse Tales. You can like it. There's a little novel that I wrote that's available from Amazon. It has nothing to do with Montana history. It's my attempt to explain almost 40 years of being a trial lawyer and what happens to people when they get involved in a murder case. That's what's coming next. I got a series of mysteries that I'm writing right now, Courthouse Mysteries. That one focuses on a Charlie Russell painting. And it's not based on a true story, except for the fact that there is a Charlie Russell painting. And that's my three buddies, Truth, Justice, and Law. And I saw them when I was up in the, I always have to give Jerry her props, when I was up in the Roosevelt County Courthouse in Wolf Point a couple years ago. And I saw those guys, not with hats on, just sitting on a shelf in her office. And I said, oh man, those guys are so cool. And I moved them together and I took a picture of them. Then I photoshopped the hats onto them. So there you go. So the last thing I want to say, first of all, I want to thank the Historical Society for the support that they've given me in my writing and my books. And I want to thank you folks. The nice thing about getting older is you can do what you want in life. And volunteering is doing something that you want. My wife volunteers in Missoula. She works at volunteer at Aging Services, helping people figure out Social Security and Medicare issues because she spent her life working in Social Security. And I'm just a bum. I just write. I don't volunteer, but I have great respect for anyone who volunteers. So thank you guys all for what you do.